Shalom, I'm Chris. Let's follow Jesus along the Talmidim way. Acts chapter 6, we're calling this one the 7 Deacons. And Acts 6 will begin with a dispute among the believers, and we'll see the apostles' great ability to solve problems, and it's a lesson that we need to look at. This will result in the calling of and raising up of the 7 deacons. And then after this, we'll see a dispute between believers and non-believers. So the first struggle was within the fellowship, and then the second is going to be an attack outside the fellowship, and that will result in the arrest of Stephen. Next time, Acts 7 is going to be a very long chapter, so we're going to get a head start on that by looking at the first part of Stephen's defense in Acts chapter 7. So at the very end, as soon as we finish chapter 6, which is pretty short, we'll look at the first 18 verses of chapter 7. Now let's ask God to bless our study. Father, we ask you to bless this study and have us be like the Bereans, who receive the word with all eagerness, but examine the scriptures daily to see whether these things be so. And by our time together, enable each of us to be doers of your word and not hearers only. We ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. In this short chapter, we're going to see two ways that Satan attacks the church, and I referenced those earlier. So there's going to be an internal attack, which comes through contention and divisions, and then the external attack, which is going to be in the way result in persecution. Persecution, while it can cause the less committed to fall away, it does tend to make the true believers in the church stronger. So persecution has an uncomfortable way of bringing the body together in really a way that nothing else can. Internal divisions, however, they're much more dangerous if they're not dealt with, because like a cancer, they can fester undetected for long periods of time, and then all of a sudden, they're spreading rapidly, and you've got a big problem on your hands. So we're going to see the internal strife first, and then we'll look at how the apostles handled that. Verse 1, now at this time, as the disciples were increasing in number, a complaint developed on the part of the Hellenistic Jews against the native Hebrews, because their widows were being overlooked in the daily serving of food. This is a Greek inscription that was found on a Jerusalem synagogue around the 1st century BC. It wasn't found in the 1st century. It was originally from the 1st century. And it describes who built the synagogue and then some of the purposes. But perhaps what's interesting is that it's all in Greek, right? And so it's at Jerusalem, you expect it to be in Hebrew. So that leads people to believe that this was a synagogue of Greek-speaking Jews in the early 1st century. And some believe that this Theodotus synagogue is the one that's going to be referenced in Acts chapter 6, verse 9. So we'll pick that up a little bit later. In our gospel study, we sometimes use this phrase, or I sometimes use this phrase, Hellenistic Jews. And that is referring to those Jews living partially a Jewish lifestyle, but more a Greek lifestyle. We might call them Sunday Christians or Christmas-only Christians. They're nominally Jewish, but they live their lives like Greeks and enjoyed the humanistic side of Greek culture, and they were kind of all in on that, but they still claim to be faithful followers. So in other words, they were compromisers. But this is not how the phrase is being used here. How it's used here is it's differentiating natural-born Jewish believers from Gentile believers or Jewish believers that were in Gentile lands. Some commentators suspect that Hellenistic Jews was a reference to those who did not speak Hebrew or Aramaic, whereas the native Hebrews, being part of a Roman culture, would have been bilingual. The picture here I just saw a couple weeks ago in the city of Corinth, and it's interesting that they've uncovered the synagogue in Corinth. Everything's written in Greek, and so it just supports the fact that out in the diaspora in the Roman Empire, there were Jewish synagogues that had Greek-speaking Jews. Being a widow was a really tough assignment in the 1st century. They were entirely dependent on others for their very survival. And so this was likely a widespread problem in all of Jerusalem that really spilled over into the church. And so this is a non-trivial matter that the widows were being neglected. And of course, the Greek-speaking Jews are claiming favoritism. Whether that was real or imagined, we don't know. But in any case, it was a real problem. And they did the right thing by bringing it forward. So the 12 summoned the congregation of the disciples and said, "It is not desirable for us to neglect the word of God in order to serve tables." Now, it sounds like a put down, but it really isn't. We'll unpack that in a bit. "Instead, brothers and sisters, select from among you 7 men of good reputation, full of the Spirit and of wisdom, whom we may put in charge of this task. But we will devote ourselves to prayer and to the ministry of the word." One thing I noticed here, and it's a good model for us to follow, is that the apostles dealt with the complaint swiftly. They didn't try to defend themselves. They didn't try to negate the concerns. They didn't shoot the messenger. And that's just a tremendous lesson for us. On the one side, if you or I have a legitimate concern, and we have to make sure our complaint is legitimate, then don't let it fester. Don't go to someone else and say, "Can you believe what they're doing?" Don't whisper, don't backbite, don't post on social media. The right thing to do is what they did here, and that escalate the matter to someone in a position to do something about it. And it's even better to share that, if you have a solution, share that with a leader. Leaders always appreciate people who bring problems as well as solutions, as opposed to those who are only complaining about problems all the time. On the other hand, if you're in a position of authority and you receive a legitimate complaint, don't get defensive and don't go on the attack. Fix the problem. First of all, vet the problem, make sure it's legitimate, and make sure it's not just a misunderstanding. But where it is in our ability to do good, we should do good. There's a great book called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. I can't recommend that book enough. The author is Pat Lencioni, and strictly speaking, it's a business book, so you'll find it in the business section of your bookstores. But really, it's appropriate for any time you have a team, and that means family. A family has to act like a team sometimes. One of the dysfunctions of a team is failure and a fear of conflict. And he writes, "Lack of conflict inhibits innovation, leads to bad decision-making, and ferments into interpersonal strife." So conflict is not necessarily bad. It's a way of arriving at the right decision, is one of the things he talks about in his book. Not raising conflict when you need to can result in everyone thinking everything's okay when it really isn't. And we might call that artificial harmony. On the other side, if you raise conflict inappropriately, that leads to mean-spirited personal attacks. So Jesus has the model for this in the book of Matthew. If you have something against your brother, go talk one-on-one and try and deal with it that way. So here in Acts, this potentially divisive situation was really handled quite well. And these are key points to remember in our ultra-contentious society where everyone's trying to score points and score victories and that kind of thing. Also note that this was, at its heart, it was an ethnic conflict. It was 2 different ethnic groups not getting along. And do we see that today? It's all around us today. So again, a great solution found out by the apostles here. This procedure that they come up with deacons is reminiscent of Moses appointing judges back in Exodus 18, right before he receives the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. We have this helper instituted here. Exodus 18, verse 16, "When they have a dispute," this is Moses speaking, "comes to me, and I judge between someone and his neighbor and make known the statutes of God and his laws. Moses, his father-in-law, whose name is Jethro, said to him, 'The thing you are doing is not good. You will surely wear out both yourself and these people who are with you.'" In other words, it's a bottleneck. This task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone. There's just too much. "Now listen to me, and I will give you counsel, and God be with you. You be the people's representative before God, and you bring the disputes to God. Then admonish them about statutes and laws, and make known about them the way in which they are to walk and the work they are to do. Furthermore," and here's the helper part, "you shall select out of all the people able men who fear God, men of truth, those who hate dishonest gain," so they need to be good citizens and good character, "and you shall place these over them as leaders of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. Let them judge the people at all times, and let it be that they will bring to you every major matter, but they will judge every minor matter themselves. So it will be easier for you, and they will carry the burden with you." And so in this Exodus passage, we also see the criteria for deacons that's referenced in verse 21 here of Exodus 18. Paul's going to later build on these attributes in 1 Timothy 3 when he has a really deep dive into the office of deacons and the office of elders. Note that in no way the apostles are saying that the ministry work that they're about to delegate is beneath them. They all had their feet washed by Jesus not that long ago. And so this taught them that no matter how lofty and no matter what your title might be, we are all still called to serve others. The way I look at this is we might say that the apostles are playing to their strengths. Their primary duty and gifting and their responsibility was in passing on Jesus' teaching. And so to do this, much like a pastor does today, they need to have time in their schedules to devote to study and preparation. I look at it like this. If someone has a gift for international missions or maybe a gift for prison ministry, would it make any sense at all to take that person and put them in charge of the kids ministry? Probably not. If they've got a passion for this, they need to be doing what God is leading them to do. If someone has a passion for kids ministry, we don't tell that person, okay, thanks for sharing. You're now in charge of international missions. So it's a person's strength. If a person wants to do different functions in the church body, and they're led by God, then by all means we should encourage that. So in the same way, the apostles had a gift of teaching, and that's not a gift that's given to everyone. So it's really not the best use of resources to have them also be in charge of keeping logs of food that's distributed, and that's just a big task. It's not that one's more important than the other. The widows had to be fed, and that's a commandment in the Old Testament, is to take care of your widows. So they're not saying it's less important. They're saying we can have different people doing these different things. So that leads to perhaps an even the most important aspect of specialization, is that we can have more people participating in ministry. And this gets hard if you have a small church because people have to wear a lot of different hats. But too often leaders feel like they need to go at it alone, and that's just not the right way. Having more people not only shares the load, which is what Jethro was talking about to Moses, but it also means when you have success, more people share in the joy. So we need to always not try and do everything ourselves, but try and build a team around us that is capable and willing and ready to serve the Lord. This announcement found approval with the whole congregation. They chose Stephen, a man full of faith and the Holy Spirit, so Stephen gets top billing. Philip, Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, Parmenas, and Nicholas, a proselyte from Antioch. And they brought these men before the apostles, and after praying, they laid their hands on them. So all 7 have Greek names, and this may be a concession to those who brought the complaint in verse 1. It's like, okay, we're going to have the ability to fix the problem, and also we're going to make sure that you're feeling included. We talk about inclusive today. Sometimes that term gets misused, but in this case, where we can make someone feel part of the team and included, who maybe have some differences, then that is a good thing. The laying on of hands here communicates blessing and commissioning, and we see that throughout the Old Testament. One example is when Moses commissioned Joshua in Numbers 27, lay your hand on him, bring him before the congregation, and commission him in their sight. We have this list, and again, they're all Greek names, probably all Greek speakers. Stephen and Philip are going to be mentioned later, but Scripture does not mention the other 5 again. We're moving into the narrative of Stephen in chapters 6 and 7. Stephen's really going to take center stage here in a moment. What you see on your screen is the discovery of what is believed to be the tomb of Philip, and it's found in Hierapolis in Turkey. I didn't get a chance to go to Hierapolis. It's more on the interior side near Colossae and Laodicea. It's one of the 3, Tri-City in that part of Turkey. And the tomb is connected with the 5th century martyrdom of Philip. And we aren't sure, though, which New Testament Philip's is involved. There's actually 2 of them. So presumably this is not the same Philip that's listed here in Acts chapter 6 as Philip the apostle. Although there is tradition that goes back to the 3rd century that ends up saying that the 2 were the same. Philip, we'll call him Philip the evangelist, will take center stage in Acts 8 as he becomes the first missionary to Samaria and later meets the Ethiopian treasurer, the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8 verse 26. It is possible, though, that the same Philip, the apostle and now the deacon, held the same office. If you're familiar with how corporations are set up today, usually the CEO, who's the main boss of the operation, is also on the oversight board of directors, and that position serves as a liaison between the oversight functions of the board and the operational functions of the CEO. So perhaps the 12 apostles named the apostle Philip as also a deacon to maintain that connectivity. But we don't know for sure. Nicholas has a very interesting tradition. First of all, he's from Antioch, and that becomes the home base of the Gentile church, which we'll see later in Acts. It played a large role in the spread of the gospel of Christ. Paul tended to begin and end his missionary journeys in Antioch. We know that a large Jewish community existed there, and many embraced Jesus as the Messiah, and so this becomes a significant launching point for missionaries. So about this Nicholas, though, according to Irenaeus, Nicholas became the author of the Gnostic sect known as the Nicolaitans. And a while back, we studied Revelation. And in Revelation 2, we have this, Nicolaitans are actually mentioned twice. The first time here in chapter 2, verse 6. You have this, that you hate the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. And then that's all we're told. We don't know who the Nicolaitans were. So there are lots of differing traditions as to whether this Nicholas founded the sect or whether people distorted his teachings and adapted his name. We just don't know. So Nicholas means ruler of the people. And according to tradition, Nicholas taught that the flesh must be treated with contempt, and he voluntarily took on a life of, a vow of poverty, a vow of no materialism, and a life of celibacy. The one problem with the celibacy part is he was married, and so eventually he brought his wife forward before the community to divorce her, and he said, anyone who desires her may marry her. And this got distorted from anyone who desires her to everyone who desires her may have her. And so, a cult is born with just a simple twist of the words there. The Nicolaitans supposedly believed that the best way to treat the flesh with contempt was by indulging it. So in other words, they lived a lifestyle completely opposite the one that Nicholas advocated. Now that's just one of many theories on who the Nicolaitans were. We don't know, but if you go back on YouTube, I did do a separate video just on some of these conjectures during our Revelation study. So it was probably a year and a half ago or so. If you want to go back and chase that video down, it is fascinating to look at the different theories. Back to Acts 6. The word kept spreading, and the number of disciples continued to increase greatly in Jerusalem. So things are going well again. And a great many of the priests were becoming obedient to the faith. And I find that fascinating. This is a reminder that no single group in the Bible is all good or all bad. What you see here is men who are of priestly lineage gather at the western wall to pronounce the priestly blessing given in Numbers 6:24 through 26. And so if you know someone by the name of Cohen or any of those variants, the Cohen is the Hebrew word for priest. And so those people are likely have Levitical background. So there were good Romans and bad Romans. There were good Pharisees and bad Pharisees. And apparently there were even a few good Sadducees along with the mostly bad Sadducees. In fact, right here in Acts 6 verse 7, maybe the only positive reference we have to the Sadducees in the entire Bible. Though in fairness, some commentators point out that not all priests were Sadducees. They point to Zechariah, who was John the Baptist's father, and Simeon, the priest who was waiting for the salvation of the Lord, who blessed the baby Jesus. And both of those are early in the book of Luke. In any case, no matter how much we may dislike a group of people, those people are still created in God's image. Those people still need saving. So try not to fall for the narrative that says a given group is always all good or all bad, whether it's in the Bible or whether it's in the front page of your newspaper today. Very important to remember there's good and bad in every group. And Stephen, full of grace and power, was performing great wonders and signs among the people. But some men from what was called the synagogue of the freedmen, including both Cyrenians and Alexandrians, so those are Africans, some from Cilicia and Asia, rose up and argued with Stephen. So that synagogue we referenced earlier, the Theodotus synagogue, here is the possible location where it might be. So it's in the city of David, and you're looking at a model of the first century of Jerusalem that's at the Israel Museum. We'll go visit there when we go to Israel. And so that inscription that we looked at on the previous slide was found discarded in a cistern, and it was found in 1913. And so again, this is a Greek-speaking synagogue right here in the heart of Jerusalem. Freedmen would denote Roman citizens. And so interesting there, this is a class-based synagogue. And do we have that today in our churches? With some churches in different counties, if you're not of a certain social status, you wouldn't feel comfortable going there. That's one thing I love about our church, is that there's none of that going on in our wonderful church. The capital of Cilicia was Tarsus, and that is Paul's hometown. So the fact that Cilicians were there means very likely Paul was in the audience here. Paul was very likely part of the crowd who was arguing, and which is ironic given that he will receive identical resistance when he ventures out into Greek-speaking synagogues a little bit later in the book of Acts. Other than we know it had to do something about Jesus, we don't really know what was the cause of the discontent or what the crowd found offensive. But they were unable to cope with Stephen's wisdom and the spirit by whom he was speaking. Then they secretly induced men to say, "We have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and God." So Luke's wording, of course, suggests that the men were not really motivated by protecting against blasphemy, but they're threatened for some other reason that maybe defies logic. And as the saying goes, if you can't pound the facts, pound the table. That's exactly what they're doing here. And they stirred up the people, the elders and the scribes, and they came up to him and dragged him, meaning Stephen, away and brought him before the council. They put forward false witnesses and said, "This man does not stop speaking against the holy place and the law." Again, false witnesses. "For you've heard him say that this Nazarene Jesus will destroy this place and change the customs which Moses handed down to us." And all who were sitting in the council stared at him, and they saw his face, which was like the face of an angel. Of course, we're never to lie, let alone bear false witness in a court of law. That's one of the 10 commandments that is written in Exodus 20, verse 16. Stephen becomes a model for us to follow when we're attacked, because our natural inclination is to fight back, and we tend to stoop to the same level as our attackers. But we need to be like Stephen, who angelically rose above literally and figuratively here. It's uncertain what about Stephen's countenance was different, but obviously something changed here. The members of the council described him looking like an angel, and angels are both awe-inspiring and terrifying, so it's probably got their attention. Whatever the case, it should have been a sign that they should have listened to Stephen rather than the false witnesses who were bringing these charges. This depiction of Stephen as an angel will contrast with the angry mob that we'll see later in chapter 7. It parallels Jesus' own transfiguration, and even Moses was transfigured this way in Exodus 34. So in chapter 7, Stephen's going to reference an angel's glory to Moses in verse 30 and 35, and then, of course, he will see Jesus' glory at the end of Acts 7. So as I mentioned, we'll cover the first few verses of Acts chapter 7, just in the interest of time. Witherington lists 10 comparisons of Stephen in Acts 7 and Jesus. So both were on trial before the high priest. Both were the subject of false witness. Both had testimony concerning the destruction of the temple, which was maybe taken out of context. They say the temple was made with hands. We have the Son of Man saying, which Stephen will quote in Acts 7, the charge of blasphemy. We have the high priest questioning the committal of their soul and spirit to the Spirit. Both Jesus did that on the cross, and Stephen will do that here. They cry out with a loud voice, and they intercede for their enemies to offer them forgiveness. So fascinating parallels between Jesus' suffering and death and Stephen's death. Now the high priest said, "Are these things so?" So the high priest here gives Stephen an opportunity to deny whatever charges might be leveled against him. Instead, depending on how one looks at it, we could say that Stephen forgoes that, and he doesn't go on defense, he goes on offense. He begins to recount Israel's history. So he's going to go through Abraham, Joseph, Moses, and some of the Old Testament history there. According to Chuck Missler, Stephen's point is going to be that one way or another, each of these Old Testament figures were rejected the first time, but accepted the second time. Now, not every commentator sees this, but at the end, Stephen is going to list Jesus among these venerated ancestors, and he'll talk about how they crucified him, and then the crowd's going to lose it. And Missler's thought is the crowd knows exactly what's happening here by this pattern. So you're saying, we have treated Jesus like you just equated Jesus to Moses and Joseph and Abraham. And so Stephen says Jesus was rejected and is executed, and then they take Stephen and execute him before he can finish the sentence. So this is going to result in a large persecution against the early believers in Jerusalem. And it's this persecution that's going to bring us back to Acts 1, verse 8, which is the theme and the outline, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and then the ends of the earth. Right now, they're content to stay in Jerusalem. This persecution is going to drive them out of Jerusalem into Judea and Samaria. So we'll cover Abraham and Joseph this time through verse 18, and then we'll save the rest of Acts 7 for the next lesson. Stephen said, "Listen to me, brothers and fathers. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran. And he said to him, 'Go from your country and your relatives and come to the land which I will show you.' Then he left the land of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran. And from there, after his father died, God had him move to the country in which you are now living." And that is fascinating to me because we don't get this from Genesis. We get this from Acts chapter 7, that God had to appear to Abraham a second time. And so we just studied Genesis, so usually I would track down all of the cross-references here. I'm going to omit that here in the interest of time. But Stephen is noting a tradition that Abraham was not immediately obedient when he got the call in Mesopotamia. What he did basically was he merely went upriver to a place called Haran and then waited for his father to pass, and then he moved on. Where in Genesis, we only have God appearing once, telling him to get going. Here, God had to appear to a second time to tell him to move. So this is also where he picked up Lot. And we studied in Genesis that whenever Abraham wasn't where he's supposed to be, he picked up some baggage. So he picks up Lot here in Haran, and he picks up Hagar in Egypt, and he accumulated wealth from those places, which becomes a snare. So it's interesting that it's not so much that Abraham was rejected, but perhaps Abraham rejected the first time, but he had to be nudged again the second time to get moving. But he gave him no inheritance in it, meaning no inheritance in the land, and not even a foot of ground. And yet he promised that he would give it to him as a possession and to his descendants after him, even though at that time he had no child. But God spoke to this effect that his descendants would be strangers in the land, not theirs, and they would enslave and mistreat them for 400 years, and whatever nation to which they are enslaved, I myself will judge, said God. And after that, they will come out and serve me in this place. And again, I'm using the NASB translation, and whenever you see in the New Testament, it's all caps, it's quoting the Old Testament, and in this case, it's quoting the book of Genesis. So on this theme of rejected the first time and accepted the second time, Abraham entered the promised land, but he did not inherit. So the top of verse 5 gave him no inheritance in it. They would be strangers in the land the first time, and that's what the middle part of verse 6 says. It is in the second time when Joshua leads them into the promised land. After that, they will come out and serve me in this place. So they did not inherit the first time, but they inherited the second time. So note this theme as Stephen works through this rather long sermon, this long message of first time rejected, second time they get it right. And he gave him the covenant of circumcision, and so Abraham fathered Isaac and circumcised him on the 8th day. Isaac fathered Jacob the 12 patriarchs. The patriarchs became jealous of Joseph. So we're moving into Joseph's story here. Sold him into Egypt, yet God was with him. So Joseph rejected the first time and rescued him from all his afflictions and granted him favor and wisdom in the sight of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, made him governor over Egypt and his entire household. Now a famine came over all Egypt and Canaan, and great affliction with it, and our fathers could find no food. But when Jacob heard there was grain in Egypt, he sent our fathers, meaning the patriarchs, the 12 tribes, what's left of them, there the first time. And on the second visit, Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and Joseph's family was revealed to Pharaoh. Then Joseph sent word and invited his father Jacob and all his relatives to come to him, 75 people in all. And of course, we just studied Joseph in great detail, so you can go back and look at our Genesis studies. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. But the bottom line is, in keeping with Stephen's theme, as suggested by Missler, Joseph himself was rejected the first time and accepted the second time. And Also, it wasn't on the brothers' first visit to Egypt, but it was on the second visit to Egypt when Joseph made himself known. So we've got a lot of this first reject, second accept theme running through here. All this is really paralleling Jesus' first coming as the rejected servant, followed by his return as conquering king, when every knee will bow and he will be accepted. So in Missler's viewpoint, that is what Stephen is leading up to here. There are a few discrepancies here and there from Stephen's account to what we read in Genesis, but we could chase these down, but really they're all easily reconcilable. There's lots of material out there if you want to search for it. Most of the differences, so I have this one listed where it says 75 people in all. When we go to Genesis, we read that there were 70 people, and so we say, well, where is this coming from? This can usually be attributed to the fact that Stephen's using the Greek Septuagint version and not the Hebrew, but really all of these are easily reconcilable. And Jacob went down to Egypt, and he and our fathers died there, and they were brought back from there to Shechem and laid in the tomb which Abraham had purchased for a son of money. We get back to the city of Shechem there, from the sons of Hamor and Shechem. But at the time of the promise which God had assured to Abraham was approaching, the people increased and multiplied in Egypt, and until another king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And that brings us to Exodus and the story of Moses, and we'll pick up there the next time, and we'll finish Acts chapter 7. So come back next week for the rest of Acts chapter 7.